In this video, I will share with you my top strategies for finding deer in and around swamps. Hey everybody, you're watching Relentless Sportsman. My entire goal of this channel is to help you find deer and find deer fast. And now we're going to look at what you need to do to find deer in and around swamps. Step one is to find a swamp on an aerial map that you want to hunt. Maybe you already know about a swamp from a buddy or a family member, but if you want to go to a swamp and you want to really pick it apart and find where the best deer are on that property, you want to start by aerial map scouting. This could be Onyx, it could be Google Earth, or any other program that you're comfortable with. Moving on to step two, since you've already identified a swamp to begin with, you want to now find where the swamp meets a different type of habitat or terrain. We call this a transition edge or a transition line. Transition lines are where the majority of the deer are going to be. Transition lines, like where a swamp meets up with a woodlot, a swamp meets up with an ag field, a swamp meets up with a different type of terrain, maybe it's a hilly terrain, that's where most of the deer activity is going to be. Now that you've found a swamp and you've identified the transition line online, you can now scout it. That'd be step three. And while you're scouting, you simply look for all kinds of different sign. That can be trails, which you should see a deer trail going around. We call that a game trail. It can be a lot of scat, which means they're probably feeding in that area on the edge of the swamp. The edge of swamp has a lot of good browse for deer, low brushy browse. You can look for where game trails kind of intersect, the deer coming out of the swamp into the dry land, or vice versa, they're crossing over that main game trail. That's a really good spot to set up on. One of the reasons why people ask me to scout and give them advice for finding deer around swamps, I think is because it's difficult to set up on deer in and around swamps. One of the reasons for that is because most people like to hunt out of a stand or in a saddle, which means they like to climb a tree. Nothing wrong with that. I prefer climbing trees given the option. However, there's a lot of great ground sitting opportunities in a swamp because of the low brush. You're not always going to find really nice, tall, straight trees that break up your outline, super easy to climb. They're not crooked, they're super comfortable. That's ideal, but around swamps, you're going to notice that there's a lot of trees that are maybe like softball size around, and they go up at a weird angle, and it just makes it difficult to be in, whether that being a saddle or a hang-on stand. If you can find a spot to set up on the ground or in a tree, you definitely want to make sure you know where the deer are bedding in that swamp. Deer bed out of the water, period. A lot of people think that deer are randomly bedded around in swamps. They're not. If there is a tree that has a kind of a root system that allows the deer to bed outside of the water, they'll do that. A lot of the does often bed on island points way off into the end of them, and the bucks will even go out further than that. They want to isolate themselves a little bit. If you're finding beds on that transition area going around the swamp, you're going to find matted down grass everywhere. A lot of times we call that doe bedding. I've seen bucks bed in that stuff too. My trail cameras tell me that bucks are also in there, especially during the rut. So you need to be careful where those deer are bedding in accordance to where you're setting up your location, whether it's a stand, saddle, or on the ground. Because of that, I recommend setting up in that situation 75 yards to 100 yards away from where you believe those deer are bedding. That's important. Anytime I've gotten closer to deer bedding than 75 yards, I've bumped deer. I don't have the skill to set up on deer in most situations at 50 yards like some people do. Now, if it's super, super windy and you have that to your advantage and the terrain features are set up where you're not going to get picked, go for it. But in my situation, I usually try to be between 75 and 100 yards of that deer's bed because I'm expecting them to come from that swamp edge, let's say that's where they're bedding, and go out into the mainland into a food source for an evening feed. That's ideally where you want to set up if you can. And of course, you have to play the wind right as well. Lots of people like hunting swamp islands, and one thing I've learned about swamp islands is that a lot of times deer don't bed on the islands themselves. They may go there to feed and browse, especially if there's acorns early season, but usually they're set up on the very, very tips of the island, or sometimes on the tips of the island, there's a couple of random trees that come off the end of the island, and that's where I found deer beds. I don't usually see them on the actual island themselves, and the sign will tell me this. I just don't see beds around islands very often. One of the reasons why swamp islands are so good is because it pushes deer to them if you're in a high density area of other hunters. Around me, I don't have too much hunting pressure, thankfully, at least the places that I go. However, if you do, you may need to consider swamp islands instead of swamp edges where other people might scare the deer away. Setting up on deer before the rut and after the rut, I always think are similar. And then it's like the exact opposite during the rut. What do I mean by that? So if the season starts here in September in Wisconsin, from September up to about October 15th, when the pre-rut starts, I'm hunting deer a lot differently. I'm heavy on food, I'm heavy on bedding. Same thing with late season. I'm heavy on food. I'm heavy on the areas where the deer transition from bedding to feeding. During the rut, it's a lot different. You can have deer running all over the place. They're actually less predictable, even though you may see more deer just because they're more active, especially during daylight hours. So before the rut, I would set up with the anticipation that deer are leaving the bedding of the swamp to feed out on dry land or on the mainland, whatever food source that happens to be. It could be an apple tree, an egg field, oak trees, whatever you happen to have or find. Same thing with late season. Now when it comes to the rut hunting around swamps, what I would do is I set up on rub lines and having this rub line going down the edge adjacent to some doe bedding or just this rub line that comes out of the swamp in general. So make this your year. I'm 100% convinced if you get out there and scout a swamp edge, that 90% eliminated of the swamp, that 10% focused in on by you looking for high quality deer sign and lots of it, you're gonna have a good success this upcoming deer season. I really believe that. I think a big problem with hunting swamps is people get overwhelmed. They don't know where to start. They're not focused on that transition line that connects these two habitats together. Now, if you go to a swamp and you're hunting this transition line or scouting this transition line and don't see a lot of sign, go to a different swamp. But I guarantee you, if there are deer in and around that swamp, that's where they're going to be. Not all swamps are created equal. Some are way better than others. If you stick it out and keep hunting these swamp edges, you will see deer and eventually you're gonna see a good one. The reason why I'm not out in a swamp right now for this video is because it's really cold. We just got hammered with snow last night and it's just dangerous being out in swamps this time of year in Wisconsin. At least that's been my experience. When I go out in swamps, I'll walk 10 steps and maybe fall through on the 10th. And it's very unpredictable. You think it's safe and frozen, but it's not, even when it's really, really cold. So I would recommend if you're in a cold climate like Wisconsin to scout swamps in April when it's completely thawed, or bring a friend along if you do want to do it in the winter because it can be kind of dangerous. You're watching Relentless Sportsman. My goal of this channel is to help you find deer fast. See you next time.